How's it everyone who's watching this? This is my 39th video of my channel, and today we're going to be looking at the first section of Sigmund Freud's 1895 essay, Project for Scientific Psychology, titled General Schema. This is one of his more obscure works, written early on in his transition from neurology to psychology. Although Freud personally saw it as a failure and would rebuke its biological slant, it is in many ways a precursor to some of psychoanalysis' core concepts, from libido theory to the ego. Lacan in particular makes heavy use of this work, especially in seminars 2 and 7. Because of the paper's length, this is going to be a bit of a longer video than usual, but if you'll find it interesting, I may make a series based on looking at some of Freud's lesser known works, maybe posting on Friday once or twice a month. Getting into the work itself, it is split into 21 sections, plus an introduction, although we'll only cover 19 of them today to try and keep this video a little shorter. Beginning the essay, Freud outlines two of the most important notions that underlie the entire project. Psychical activity is characterized by quantities that obey the laws of motion, and the material components connected to them are the neurons. To give some context, quantities to Freud essentially refer to intensities of stimuli, defined in his 1894 paper Neuropsychoses of Defense, like so.
In mental functions, something is to be distinguished, a sum of excitation which possesses all the characteristics of a quantity, which is capable of increase, diminution.
Essentially, these quantities act similarly to what Freud describes as flows of electric liquid in physics, being not unlike electric charges. With this in mind, we can turn now to section 1 of the essay at hand, fittingly titled First Thesis, the Quantitative Line of Approach. Inspired by thermodynamics, he introduces what he calls the law of neuronal inertia, the idea that neurons strip themselves of quantity in order to maintain equilibrium. In his words,
a primary neuronal system, having acquired a quantity, employs it only in order to get rid of it.
Freud demonstrates this process through the example of reflexes. As seen in this diagram, quantities from external stimuli, like for example being hit, are discharged through movement. However, this is complicated by the fact that those external quantities aren't all there are. Instead, they're also what Freud calls endogenous or internal ones, things like hunger and thirst, which are continually released. Although they might be momentarily quenched by eating or drinking, they're constantly lurking and adding up. It is only in death that an organism can get rid of them completely. In this way, the law of inertia can never be fully actualized. Instead, the nervous system has to be able to tolerate a certain amount of quantity, albeit as limited and as close to zero as possible. If you are familiar with Freudian theory, this basically sets the groundwork for the nirvana and pleasure principles, where the former deals with the law in its idealized form, and the latter concerns its limited one. With this, we get to section 2, second thesis, the Neuron Theory. The main takeaway from this section is that quantity theory and neurons, which as little aside Freud helped discover, are closely intertwined. Setting the scene, he describes neurons as forming lines of conduction that connect them together. These function through what can be seen in this diagram as dendrites and axons. The first are where the paths connect, whilst the second describe where discharge occurs. Connecting to the first section, neurons can be thought of as being invested, or rather to use the psychoanalytic term cathected, with quantity, to greater or lesser degrees. In a sense, they perform the same processes as the neuronal system as a whole, just in miniature. Paths of conduction align with the law of inertia through the currents that pass along dendrites and discharge via the axons. Moving on now to internal quantities, as Freud says,
the secondary function, which requires quantity to be stored up, is made possible by supposing that there are resistances which oppose discharge.
These resistances hamper the movement of quantities through paths of conduction, inhabiting what Freud calls contact barriers, the places where one neuron ends and another begins. Turning now to section 3, named after these barriers, we can see just how important they are by looking at the phenomenon of memory. Freud defines it as the permanent alteration of nervous tissue caused by a single process or flow of quantity. If contact barriers did not exist, this wouldn't be possible. Quantity would just pass through like a wave. This is where Freud introduces his infamous phi and psi systems, defined as being permeable and impermeable respectively. In the first, quantities are received the same way again and again, whilst in the second, as Freud says,
Psi neurons are permanently altered by the course of an excitation. Their contact barriers are brought into a permanently altered condition.
This process is what I will translate as frayage, in line with Jacques Lacan. Sometimes referred to as facilitation in English, this involves psi neurons becoming more and more permeable, or conductive. We can observe this in the simple act of learning, where frayage makes it easier for information to be remembered. In Freud's eyes, memory is the result of the complex relations of frayage in the psi system. Moreover, it occurs closely connected to the law of inertia. Whilst the nervous system must develop impermeable neurons to undergo the cathexis of internal stimuli, it always seeks the removal of those same quantities. As such, as you can see in this diagram, that frayage acts to make discharge easier. With this, we swiftly arrive at section 4, the biological standpoint. Here, Freud aims to justify distinguishing between these two systems by using biology. Setting the scene, as he reminds us,
from the very first, the neuronal system had two functions: to receive stimuli from without and to discharge excitations of endogenous origin.
Concerning the first of these tasks is the phi system that is involved. Turned towards the outside, it is what accepts external quantities. Much the same way, the psi system receives endogenous or internal ones. Stated in this way, the existence of the two systems isn't all that far-fetched. They each have a specific purpose. When it comes to biology, Freud associates them with things already familiar to science in his time: the grey matter of a spinal cord for phi, and the grey matter of a brain for psi. However, there's still a set of questions that need answering. Namely, why is phi permeable? On the flip side, why isn't psi? The role of contact barriers rests at the root of the issue, seemingly having no function when it comes to phi, whilst being indispensable to psi. Freud steps around this issue by reminding us of frayage and how, operated by quantity, it makes psi neurons more like their conductive counterparts. This leads to the possible reason for their divide being the intensity or frequency of the quantities they have to deal with, external ones being of a greater magnitude than internal ones. In a way, contact barriers from the phi system can therefore be considered as one and the same as those of psi, simply having a higher degree of frayage. As Freud says,
a distinction in their essence is thus replaced by a distinction in the milieu to which they happen to be allocated.
Here, he makes clear his distinction between external quantities, represented with Q, and internal ones, those that he calls psychical, marked with the symbol Q eta. When it comes to the function of a phi system, it discharges psychical quantities, influenced by an influx of external ones. If we compare this to the psi one, we see that external quantities only enter it through the filter of phi, one of its main purposes being to simply discharge psychical ones into its permeable counterpart. This brings us to the fifth section of the general schema, which Freud titles The Problem of Quantity. The purpose of this section is essentially to give a small provisional outline of a nervous system as a whole. Freud begins by writing,
the hypothesis I've been discussing preserves the essential sameness of phi and psi neurons, while their difference in respect of permeability is biologically explained.
Unfortunately, as he himself admits, he was unable to test this hypothesis due to the constraints of the times. However, Freud says we can still develop some interesting questions based upon it. For example, is the law of inertia in play during the receiving process? Freud's answer is yes, given that we find phi neurons connected to the periphery not directly, but rather through what he generally terms nerve-ending apparatuses. Their purpose is to screen out major quantities that would otherwise mess with the functioning of a phi system, only allowing quotients or small amounts to pass through. In this way, we can get a glimpse of a nervous system and how it works. It's composed of multiple systems with an increasing tendency to hold back quantity from neurons, to borrow Freud's turn of phrase. Essentially, its structure serves to limit quantity, whilst its function concerns itself with the removal of what gets through. Moving along quickly, we get to section 6, simply titled Pain. All biological systems, Freud says, fail when pushed past certain limits. The nervous system is no exception. Nerve endings act to hold back quantities from phi, which in turn holds them back from psi, but this isn't always successful. In his eyes, this is most obvious in the phenomenon of pain. It occurs in two main ways. Firstly, any quantity of a great enough magnitude turns into pain through pushing past the limits of a system. Secondly, Relatively small quantities are able to provoke pain when they manage to bypass the nerve-ending apparatus and act directly on the phi neurons. To borrow Freud's words,
pain is thus characterized by the eruption of excessively large quantities into phi and psi, that is, of quantities which are of a higher order than the phi stimuli.
This, on first glance, may seem to go against what we just said about small quantities, but it's important to remember that nerve endings only transport a quotient of quantity through to phi. As such, a quantity that's small enough to slip through them may be still too large for the phi system to handle. Ending the section, he says that in each case, both systems are put in motion. Focusing on psi in particular, he observes that the phrase that results from pain is often permanent, something leading to the creation of a path of conduction similar to that of the phi system. It's with this that we get to the 7th section of our essay, the problem of quality. So far, Freud says that we've neglected one very important aspect of any psychological theory, consciousness. Rather than quantities, this deals first and foremost with qualities. As such, our system organized around phi and psi has to be revised, given that it essentially focuses solely on the former. To guide us, he offers 2 questions, albeit with a slight disclaimer attached.
We may ask how qualities originate and where qualities originate. These are questions that need the most careful investigation, but they cannot be exhaustively treated here.
Even if he can't cover them in as much detail as they deserve, Freud still wants to address these questions. In his eyes, their answer doesn't lie in the external world, which he sees as completely quantitative in nature. Likewise, the phi system isn't of that much help either. Although both it and consciousness are undoubtedly connected to perception, the latter for Freud inhabits a higher level in the nervous system. However, this isn't to say that it's part and parcel with psi. In his eyes, although it's responsible for memory and recollection, psi is, by itself, necessarily devoid of quality. Instead, Freud says that there exists a third system, that of the so-called perceptual neurons. Returning to the Greek alphabet, it designates the system under the letter omega, something of a joke based on the German word for perception, which starts with a W. In it, quantities, even smaller than those of the psi system, are converted into qualities. Although omega neurons are still cathected, they are only barely. Almost all quantity has been sieved out by the time it reaches them. To explain how it's possible such small quantities can give rise to the vivid and often ever-changing phenomenon of consciousness, is here that Freud introduces what he calls period. To put simply, the period of a stimulus is like its pre-qualitative aspect, able to bypass the filtering mechanisms that the nervous system constructs to protect itself from quantities. These sense organs, like the eyes, act as sieves for omega, only letting in quantities of a certain period. These are, in turn, experienced as conscious perceptions. It's on this note that we get to the relatively brief section, consciousness. In this part of the project, Freud singles out 3 features of the omega system. It must discharge a quantity of some sort. This discharge inevitably leads to the loss of quality's characteristics, and the quantity that affects them must come from the psi system. Concerning this last point, this is because Freud wants to maintain the omega system status as separated from phi and thus the outside. At this point, he differentiates between 2 series that make up the content of consciousness, the series of qualities and the series of pleasure and unpleasure. He defines unpleasure as the buildup of tension that results from rises in quantity, whilst pleasure corresponds to the discharge of that tension. These emanate from omega, cathected with quantity sourced from psi. With this, we can finally sketch out the phi, psi, and omega systems function as a whole, in more depth than we did earlier. This is the focus of section 9, fittingly titled, well, the functioning of the apparatus. As can be seen here, stimuli first enter the system through nerve endings, being broken down into quotients and sieved down depending on their period, represented with a dotted line. As such, they enter the phi system having both a quantitative and qualitative aspect, although the latter only becomes apparent in omega. However, there is a discrepancy between stimuli as they exist in the external world and as they exist psychically. This is because nerve-ending apparatuses only allow medium quantities through, bringing down big quantities and ignoring small ones. Likewise, only certain periods are permitted, as seen in this diagram supplied by Freud himself. Concerning what does get through, these are discharged in 2 ways, one quantitative, the other qualitative. On the one hand, periods, once they enter omega, take the form of sensations in consciousness. On the other, quantities are removed through motor function or movement. This can take quite a few forms. Freud writing,
quantities translated into phi enter the muscles, glands, etc., and act in them as a release.
Outside of this motor function, neurons are also able to transfer quantities between each other. For example, like we've seen throughout, phi neurons pass quotients of external ones to their counterparts in the psi system. However, to borrow again from Freud,
the sensory paths of conduction in phi have a peculiar structure. They constantly send out branches and exhibit thicker and thinner paths which terminate at numerous endpoints.
Freud, again limited by the technology of his time, wasn't entirely sure why it works this way. However, he does provide this diagram as a way to explain one possible answer. Basically, the level of cathexis in a specific psi neuron isn't proportional to how large the quantities are that it receives from phi. Instead, larger quantities simply take different paths than smaller ones, cathecting a greater number of neurons in the process. In this way, quantity in phi is expressed as complexity in psi. The greater the magnitude, the more cathected neurons. Ending the section, Freud distinguishes between pallium psi neurons and nucleus psi neurons. The first refer to those that are cathected by quantities from the phi system, whilst the second refers to those cathected by internal paths of conduction. To explain the names, the pallium basically just refers to the outermost layers of the brain, hence where it connects with the rest of the nervous system. The distinction between these sets of neurons is one of the main focuses of section 10, the psi paths of conduction, where Freud says that the driving force between mental activity lies in the interplay between nuclear neurons and psychical quantities. To explain this, he sees those quantities as constantly accumulating on the intercellular level, only periodically reaching a great enough magnitude to excite the nucleus by bypassing the resistances of their contact barriers. However, say unlike with pain, those resistances reappear after discharge. This whole process is called summation by Freud, who writes,
the psi paths of conduction are filled by summation until they become permeable.
At this point, a paradox seems to appear. If psi neurons can alternate between being permeable and being impermeable, how is it that they can account for memory? Freud solves this problem by underlining the fact that resistances in the contact barriers never fully disappear. Rather, after their suspension, they return in a less powerful form. In other words, they fray. With section 11, the experience of satisfaction, Freud turns his attention towards how the nuclear neurons discharge their quantities. Basically, after summation has led up to a build-up in the psi system, the first thing that occurs is what he calls internal change, which might manifest itself in the form of emotional expression, or in a more extreme case, screaming. However, this is most often insufficient.
As we showed at the beginning of the discussion, no discharge of this kind can bring about any relief of tension because internal stimuli continue to be received in spite of it.
It's only through some sort of external change that the psi neurons can receive respite, like food to deal with hunger or water for thirst. At this point, Freud introduces the concept of specific actions, which he defines as what has to be done to achieve release from tension. In the case of young children, they can't undertake these things themselves, and they require external help. Here, internal change as a method of discharge is critical. The child gets the aid they need through things like screaming, supplying this kind of change with the important secondary function of producing understanding. The entire process, from summation to release, is what Freud calls an experience of satisfaction, something that impacts the psi system of a child in a myriad of ways. To start off with, there's the fairly obvious effect of removing the quantities that gave rise to unpleasure in omega. On a deeper level, though, there's also cathexis in the pallium neurons related to the perception of a specific object in phi, along with the creation of a so-called memory image of what action led to satisfaction. At this point, Freud introduces another principle that dictates the behavior of quantities through the nervous system, the law of association in simultaneity. Essentially, according to Freud, two psi neurons that are cathected simultaneously by the phi system are able to form a path of conduction between them. At the heart of this principle is the idea that quantities pass between cathected neurons more easily than non-cathected ones. In this way, there are two things that direct movement. On the one hand, there's the tendency to follow the most frayed path of conduction. On the other, there's the tendency to go towards another cathected neuron. These sometimes align, but not always, as seen in this diagram. Turning back now to the experience of satisfaction, this law explains how a link or frayage forms between the memory image of a wished-for object and the memory image of a related specific action, both being recorded by the pallium neurons at the end of the original experience. In certain cases, this leads to hallucinations. When in a state of unpleasure, for example, the organism may recathect the two memory images, even when there's nothing in the real world that corresponds to them in the present. As we'll get to in a little later, there needs to be some sort of mechanism for reality checking to stop this from happening. For now though, Freud turns his attention to the experience of pain, taking us to the next section of the same name. Here, his focus is on developing what we went over in section 6 with the new concepts he's just introduced. To get right into it, pain has three impacts on the psi system. To begin with, there's a rising quantity, experienced in omega as unpleasure. Secondly, in Freud's words,
there is an inclination to discharge, which can be modified in several directions.
Then thirdly, frayage occurs between the memory image of the object that caused the pain in the first place and that inclination described by Freud. When the memory image of this hostile object is recathected, something similar to but distinct from pain results. Unlike pain proper, it doesn't find its source in unfiltered external quantities. Rather, the quantity involved in recathecting the memory image of a hostile object is equivalent to that of any other perception. In this way, Freud says we must think about the cathexis of memories as being able to release unpleasure. To explain, he introduces what he terms secretory or key neurons, those that generate internal stimuli when excited. Unlike motor neurons which discharge quantity into muscles when cathected, key neurons instead introduce it in a roundabout manner. With this, we get to section 13, titled Affects and Wishful States. Essentially, these refer to the leftovers from painful and satisfying experiences that remain in memory. As Freud says, both
involve a heightening of the quantitative tension in psi. In the case of an effect, this is brought about by sudden release, and in that of a wish, by means of summation.
Here, Freud distinguishes between two important concepts, primary defense and wishful attraction. In the first case, the memory image of a hostile object that caused unpleasure in the past has cathexis directed away from it, as if by repulsion. In the second, on the other hand, an attraction is felt towards the memory image of an object that has given rise to pleasure. This can be accounted for by a particularly effective frayage between the psi nucleus and the pallium neurons. Primary defense, however, is a little more tricky. Freud explains it as the result of the psi system learning from biological experience. In other words, primary defense stems from a system trying to replicate the conditions that followed the end of a hostile object's perception, represented by the image of the movement or external change that allowed the nervous system to escape its influence. Here we get to one of the most interesting sections of the essay, at least in my opinion, introduction of the concept of an ego. Here, as the name suggests, Freud lays out one of his very first formulations of the ego. Putting it simply, the fact that stimuli are treated differently based on how they are originally encountered, be it as pain or satisfaction, points to an organization that interferes with the passage of quantities. This is what Freud calls the ego. Adding on that,
it may thus be defined as the totality of psi cathexes at any given time, and in these a permanent portion may be distinguished from a changing one.
As new objects are encountered and old ones are experienced differently, these cathexes shift, and frayage modifies the neuron's paths of conduction. In this way, the ego is never static, it's always in movement. Its main purpose, the regulation of quantities, functions through what Freud calls inhibition. This unfolds in lateral cathexis, the law of simultaneity allowing the momentary frayage between two psi neurons to divert the current of quantity away from where it would usually go. To illustrate this, Freud himself offers a good diagram, the one that's in the thumbnail of this video. As you can see here, there are two paths that cycle quantity can take, from A to B or A to alpha. Normally, it would take the first of these. However, under the influence of inhibition and lateral cathexis, what instead takes place is the second. The flow moves from A through to delta. The reason for this is that A, in this case, is a hostile memory, with B being a key neuron. Through the ego's interference, unpleasure is thus avoided by diverting the current in another direction. In this way, the ego is vital to protecting the nervous system. If B were to be recathected, increasing the magnitude of psychical quantity in the system, unpleasure would result. It's only through inhibition that this doesn't happen. Moving on to section 15, the primary and secondary processes in psi, Freud continues this line of thought by saying,
there are two situations in which the ego in psi is liable to fall into a helpless state in which it is exposed to damage.
The first occurs when the process of discharge is begun, whilst only the memory image of an object is cathected. In other words, when the psi system acts as if a certain object is there, when it isn't. The second, on the other hand, takes place when the psi system fails to put inhibition in action against the recathexis of a hostile object's memory image. This leads to an immense release of unpleasure, since the cathexis can't step in to redirect the current of quantity. In both cases, the problem is a confusion between a memory or idea and a perception. The ego thus must always have a way to distinguish the two in order to protect itself. On this, Freud says that there is likely a role played by consciousness. Essentially, omega connects qualitative excitations to external perceptions. These excitations, called perceptual discharges, enter psi as memories. These allow psi to differentiate between what is real and what isn't, each real perception being tied to the report of a perceptual discharge. The ego's role here is to stop hallucinatory cathexes from being registered or indicated as real by the omega system. Inhibition acts to stifle the full cathexis of a wished-for object, stopping it from provoking something in omega. For Freud, the distinction between perceptions and memories lie in how omega interprets them. Perceptions, no matter how big or small, are able to pass through via period into the system. However, memories can only be affected from the psi system if they are of great enough magnitude. In this way, the ego's inhibition is crucial to reality testing. This is where Freud introduces his notion of primary and secondary processes, which he would later develop in the interpretation of dreams. He explains the first by stating,
wishful cathexis carried to the point of hallucination and a complete generation of unpleasure may be described as psychical primary processes.
To borrow from my video on Lyotard's libidinal band, wishes involve the memory of an object being recathected with quantity, even when that object isn't physically present. When not kept in check, this cathexis is experienced as a hallucination, like we talked about earlier, being registered as an actual perception, when in fact nothing of the sort is true. Turning to the secondary processes, these are what act to keep the free flow of quantity from wreaking havoc on the nervous system, inhibition being one example. Summarizing, we can diagram them together like so. The essential difference between them is that, whilst the primary processes jump straight from memory image to discharge, the secondary ones force the flow of quantity to wait for a match with the omega system. If that match isn't found, no discharge can occur. In the next section, titled Cognitive and Reproductive Thought, Freud goes over a couple of situations where these two sets of processes interact. The first case involves wishes occurring at the exact same time as the perception of this object, which leads to a successful discharge of tension. When it comes to the second case, it's a bit more complicated. Here, the wish only partially aligns with the perception. Setting the stage to explain what happens when this takes place, he says,
this is the moment at which to recall the fact that perceptual cathexes are never cathexes of single neurons, but always of complexes.
As such, we can imagine a wish that connects to the neurons A and B with a perception that connects to A and C. In this case, omega might at first deny discharge, since it can only confirm the reality of part of the complex. To work out what to do, the apparatus must undertake what Freud calls judgment. This takes the form of relating complexes together, analyzing the perception in terms of parts. Neuron A remains the same, whilst neuron B varies. The constant is what is considered to be a thing, whilst the variant is instead relegated to the status of simply being an activity or attribute. To give an example, maybe there's a wish for a green apple and a perception of a red one. The apple itself is what is cathected in neuron A, whilst the color varies between B and C. Going further, Freud says that the ego interpolates missing neurons. How this works is that the ego forges new connections between the perceived neuron, C, and the neuron that exists only in the memory image, B, transferring quantity from one neuron to another until the missing one is found. Concerning the result of this process, Freud writes,
as a rule, What is interpolated between neuron C and neuron B is a motor image.
What he means by this is that the connection between two neurons takes the form of a movement of some kind. Giving an example of how this takes place, he offers the case of a baby observing its mother's breast, a process which involves 5 main steps as seen here. Firstly, the baby creates a memory image of a breast from a front view. Next, when hungry, it wishes for it as an object of nourishment, but only sees it from the side. This at first leads to its omega system failing to recognize it. However, in its psi system, it holds a memory of moving its head to get a side view of the same breast. This motor image, an idea of movement, spurs it to try the reverse, to produce a front view. In the end, it's able to use this to connect the two images together, creating a shared identity between them. In Freud's eyes, this whole process is the result of a quantity from the cathected ego traveling according to a specific aim, the return to a missing neuron and the release of a sensation of identity. This release corresponds to a state where only the missing neuron is cathected, in other words, where the wish and the perception align. This whole process of interpolation is called reproductive thinking, and is possible because the missing neuron B is kept cathected by the wish. This makes it easier, although not necessarily easy, for quantities to move towards it, since cathexis leads to higher degrees of frayage. Skipping ahead for the sake of time, we arrive now at section 19, called Sleep and Dreams. Freud's focus here is on the source of the primary processes, something that 2 facts can guide us on.
Primary psi processes of a kind that have been gradually suppressed by biological pressure in the course of the evolution of psi are daily presented to us during sleep. A second fact of equal importance is that the pathological mechanisms which are revealed by the most careful analysis in the psychoneuroses bear the greatest similarity to dream processes.
However, before we get ahead of ourselves, we need to understand how the nervous system deals with sleep. In particular, Freud singles out the withdrawal of cathexes from the ego as an important precondition, something that can be observed in how much easier it is to sleep once tensions like hunger and thirst have been removed. In addition, as he says,
it's a highly interesting fact that the state of sleep begins and is evoked by the closing of those sense organs that are capable of being closed.
For sleep to be possible, it's important that perceptions not be made, stimuli entering from psi via phi having a negative effect. In his eyes, this shows that there is something that connects the two systems when awake to allow perceptions to be registered, termed attention by Freud. This attention is a constant yet displaceable cathexis that allows for frayage and thus the permeability of the pallium neurons of a psi system. Withdrawing attention stops perceptions from passing through in most cases, quantities being of too small magnitude to break through by themselves. On that note, we get to the analysis of dreams, section 20. Getting into it, Freud breaks this section down into a number of bullet-pointed paragraphs, listing some of the characteristics of, well, dreams. To list them out, they are the lack of motor discharge or movement, an abundance of bizarre connections, ideas that appear hallucinatory, definable meanings, a lack of damage to the system as a whole, and lastly, but not so leastly, a qualitative character. When it comes to the first, this is easily explainable by the lack of cathexis during sleep. Basically, movement is impossible because stimuli from phi are unable to transfer quantity to uncathected pallium neurons. When it comes to the second, his explanation of what he calls strangely dimensioned connections falls back on the law of association by simultaneity. Essentially, 2 cathexes that occur at the same time must connect, forming seemingly strange associations. For example, spectators at a meeting where a bomb went off assumed that it was just a gun being fired to signal an effective speech. Alongside this, there are also nonsensical connections. These are caused, to borrow his words, by the fact that
all those biological experiences have been forgotten which normally inhibit the primary process, and this is due to the insufficient cathexis of the ego.
There's still some degree of cathexis, without which Freud says dreaming would be impossible, but not enough to institute the secondary processes. All this remaining portion does is create phrases to allow the connection of diverse images together, hence all the weirdness found in sleep. Moving on to number 3, this is what Freud sees as dreaming's most important feature. What he means by hallucinatory is that, despite not perceiving actual objects, the dreamer is still able to experience things as if they were real. Freud explains how this happens with a return to the primary processes. Essentially, the result of recathecting a memory image is always hallucinatory in nature. It's only through the ego's inhibition, a secondary process, that it is possible to undertake a reality check. As we just saw with bizarre connections, this simply isn't possible when asleep. Moving on, the next characteristic concerns the meaning and purpose of dreams. Put simply, dreams are first and foremost wish fulfillments, primary processes that involve experiences of satisfaction. As such, they have the specific goal of trying to remove tension, but this is hampered by the fact that nothing can be discharged through movement. Like we said earlier, fire is basically off limits. With this, we get to the penultimate feature described by Freud, the feature that, unlike many primary processes, dreams don't cause any damage to the nervous system. In his words, this is because
dreams mostly follow old phrases and thus cause no changes, and that, owing to the paralysis of motor function, they leave no traces of discharge behind them.
A consequence is that memory appears to be very faulty whilst asleep, since new connections between memory images can't be called upon. However, this is essentially a necessary price to pay in order to keep unpleasure at bay. At this point, the last characteristic he lays out is that consciousness, the omega system, produces quality in sleep just like when awake. The implications of this are profound. To begin with, it shows that the ego isn't the sole source of consciousness. Instead, other parts of psi can also get involved, the ego not being any more special on account of its withdrawal of cathexes. In the second place, this also shows that primary processes cannot be associated with the unconscious alone. Personally, this was really quite eye-opening for me, since it firmly distinguishes the psychoanalytic unconscious from what is associated with the word as it's commonly used. You're still conscious whilst asleep. On this note, we get to the very last part of the manuscript's general schema, titled rather fittingly, Dream Consciousness. This is very brief and basically just serves to explain in a bit more detail how the meaning of dreams gets obscured. Basically, as seen in this diagram supplied by Freud himself, everything starts out with a specific dream idea, marked with an A. This normally would connect to B, but due to other factors, this doesn't occur. Instead, a simultaneous cathexis, marked here as D, occurs in a neuron quite far from the original idea, the intermediary being C. It's this middle point that gets cathected in favor of B, a direct result of a law of simultaneous association. Now, this might sound a bit confusing, but essentially this process just involves the discovery of a path of least resistance that just happens to not include B. As a result, vital context behind the dream seemingly goes missing, leading to the covering up of wishes. As Freud says,
our consciousness of dream ideas is above all a discontinuous one. It does not become aware of a whole chain of associations, but only of separate points in it.
Now, it's with this that we finish the general schema of Sigmund Freud's essay on a project for scientific psychology, understanding the role of quantity in the nervous system. Although Freud would later turn his back on the paper, never publishing it in his lifetime, I feel it's incredibly helpful as an introduction to some of his key concepts, even if it's not exactly reader-friendly. In particular, just replacing the word psychical quantity with libido offers an excellent glance into his theory of sexuality, the same basic idea of a principle of inertia and a desire to reach equilibrium being essentially omnipresent. All in all, I truly hope you enjoyed or learned something, and if you feel I got anything wrong, please do feel free to let me know in the comments so I can do better. I know this has been quite a long video, so thank you for staying till the end. Next time, we'll start a series on our first Quantitative book, The 3 Ecologies. Until then, bye!